point of it is not to cut class. Oh, because Dr. Kalinsky recorded it, but it's just there for your future use. No need to circle back up. We'll just kind of handle the last of the discussion from last time. You guys were on the summary slide, weren't you? Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's continue listening from Kennedy and Logan for a minute or two. Oh, it's not on the discussion slide. There we go. Do you guys need a recap, or you guys remember Joseph and Petra from last time? Yeah. All right.
Before we go through the quick summary, we wanted to talk about what could be done in the future, and so we briefly talked last time about different variables that also may play a role in mate selection. I remember some of the ideas that we threw out on that, in addition to cache size.
It's typically common among lots of different birds.
Like physical coloring or character.
Yeah, so plumage,
Size.
it's usually a big one, size. Yeah, they also usually have like some sort of song or like expression, dance per se. They can add to that.
And then additionally, we kind of talked about territories, and so there are different characteristics of a particular mate's territories that may play a role. So how available resources are in a territory, or as we saw in the picture at the beginning of our presentation, potentially the closeness to water, proximity to water can play a role in mate selection too. So so our next logical experiment would be kind of trying to determine how weighted each of these factors might be in mate selection and how they all play a role to create a comprehensive idea of how shrikes participate in mate selection. And so, yeah. go ahead.
There's actually something that like allows us to figure out how influential different variables are on mating behavior, and I don't know if any of you guys would be familiar with it, but it's called path analysis. Have any of you heard of that before?
Oh, come on, Kennedy. Probably not.
Well, I hadn't, so didn't know if
Yes.
anybody else had. But
Do you want to explain that to them or not?
I mean, it just, like I said, it allows us to figure out how influential different variables are on mating behavior. So like, you know, how does size affect X variable, and then how does plumage affect X variable, and all of those things.
Yeah, it's an extension of multiple regression analysis, which if you take a staff class, you would learn about, that allows you to see how a set of variables influence some predicted variables, and it allows you to generate what they call partial correlation coefficients, which tells you how does this variable influence this other variable, holding all of the other variables constant in a sense. And so you can parse what the specifics of the various things that might be influencing mate behavior. So if size is important for holding a territory, then and the bigger you are, the better the territory you are, that invariably would have an effect on cache size. Well, then body size and cache size are correlated with one another, and both of those are simultaneously influencing mating success. So then how does body size influence mating success, holding cache size and territory quality and all these other things constant? And so it's a good technique for getting at more than what they addressed in this paper, because they really were just focused on cache size.
Right. And we kind of discussed how it would have been pretty easy for them to measure size in this experiment, just to even take it remotely into account, because they already caught the birds to like mark them with their band. So it would have been pretty easy just for them to take a couple measurements while they were in that process.
Yeah, and let this be a lesson to you. When you have a bird in hand, take all the data you can on it. So.
So really the only thing left is the general summary. So I figured the best way to do it would be, what's the question they posed, what was their hypothesis, what were the findings, what conclusions did they draw? So does anybody want to say what was their question, what do they want to investigate here?
For their purpose, I guess.
What was their
then you remember the paper, you didn't need to go through and rehash it.
The question was, how does cache size play a role in mate selection?
Yep. So then, what was their hypothesis based on previous observations and work?
Higher caching at the beginning of breeding season.
That was one of the predictions that they made. So their overall hypothesis would have been cache size plays a role in mate selection, strikes.
Mate attraction in general.
Yeah.
Anybody remember the other predictions that they made?
So we have that it increased at the beginning of breeding season, just before breeding season.
Well, I'm not really going in order, but another
Yeah.
one was increased cache size leads to more offspring.
So then the final prediction kind of plays in pretty closely with Luke's.
Males with the richer cache size are gonna pair off before the others.
So there's a timing thing, there's a reproductive output thing, what's the third thing? So it's tightly tied to reproductive output. In order to produce offspring, you have to have mates. You have to have mates, and you have to have territory. Well, everybody has territory.
Yeah.
Until you abandon it.
Oh, food.
You have to have food.
Were you talking about the increased cache size at the beginning of mating season?
I'm talking about the stable here.
I mean, it extends the breeding period.
Extends the breeding period, so the timing was important. Luke talked about the number of fledglings that came out of it. What else is in here?
Or maybe
Nestlings.
Number of nests that are laid throughout the breeding season.
Eggs. in each
Total number of
clutch.
eggs, yep, eggs in each clutch, et cetera, et cetera. All those things add up to influencing the number of fledglings that are there.
Right.
Yeah, so like we kind of just talked about, each of their predictions was kind of confirmed. They their prediction was confirmed that cache size increases just before breeding season. And then there's gonna be more offspring for males who have larger cache size. What were some of the other notable results that they obtained from their experiment? Specifically about caches that were depleted. What did they find in that?
Those no offspring.
Yeah, so they didn't even make.
Not only did they not mate, what did they do? They flew away. It's like, keep stealing my food. I'm just not gonna stay in this neighborhood anymore. So not only did no birds pair, no females pair with those males eventually abandoned their territories. That's pretty striking in my mind.
So then, and what overall findings, what was the main conclusion gleaned from the results? Last question.
All of the other previously known reasons why shrikes cache their food. To those reasons, we can add to attract mates. And they proved it different ways about how it was attractive.
Yep. So that's a good way of saying it. To that list of things, we can add this other thing. It doesn't mean that those other things don't also have function. It's just that there's this third function that nobody had thought about that also can be added to the explanation of why birds do this behavior.
Especially some of those behaviors, you know, they couldn't necessarily explain, like, why would they impale things that they can't eat or that are just like random objects in general, you know, like those kinds of things, so.
So it kind of helps fill in a couple gaps that these other hypotheses left.
Yeah. So, you guys are still stressing a little bit about specifications grading, so here's the rubric for doing what Kennedy and Logan just did. Did the facilitators introduce the big idea? Yeah, they did. Check that off. Did they cover the introductory material sufficiently so that we understood the background and purpose of the study? Yeah, sure they did. Did they cover the methods and results? Now, how did they go about all this?
That's a good question.
They asked you a bunch of questions, didn't they? So they covered the methods, the facilitators covered the discussion completely. True or not? True or not? True. Did they accomplish the above task primarily by engaging their peers in discussion? Yes. Did all peers contribute equally in the discussion? You know, some of you were patently silent last time, and you need to not do that in the future. Did the coverage of discussion represent the highest levels of Bloom's taxonomy? Remember, what are those? Analyzing and creating. Analyzed what happened, thinking about what next steps would be. Okay, they did that. So here's asked introductory and follow-up questions that elicited elaborative responses, more than merely yes, no responses. Yeah, sure. A lot of times they would ask you a question, they would give you an answer, you would give them an answer, and then they would follow that up immediately with a question designed to delve a little deeper into what you just said. They had a PowerPoint presentation that helped them go through the material. Did they provide a general summary at the end? Did they share the load? Yes. Check, 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 check. You pass. This is all you have to do. The guidelines are there. Just do what the guidelines say. Do what the guidelines say. You check off all the boxes. You pass that particular assignment. The kind of things that they did for you Friday and today are the kinds of things that you need to be doing with the rest of the class as you handle your literature that you're going to be leading a discussion for. I've already checked all of these things on my version of their grading sheet. The only thing that I didn't check was Bloom's taxonomy, because we haven't really gotten to that portion yet. They did that fine. You're done with this assignment. We get to move on. Questions? All right, cool. What?
I said first pass of the class.
First pass of the class, nice. Yeah. Okay. Just a couple of other things, just to cover some things. I introduced this last time, and I want you to know that it's finished and it is on the Moodle site now. In addition to things that we talked about last time, I've also added a section. I think some of you are struggling with how to talk about statistics. Why is this so freaking wide? There we go. So I've added a little section on how to write about statistics. So just some general guidelines. There are examples both in the paragraph, and then there are also some sample examples down here. When you're writing about this in the results section, you basically in the results make a claim and then write the statistical results in a parenthetical statement, including the figure that we can go and look at. And so this is one sentence that for me describes the unconscious selection part of the Bean experiment that we did in lab last week. And it basically says, this is what we found. This is why you should believe me. And then this goes on to talk about the consistency of the selection that was going on. So it talks about R square in a separate little part of the sentence. This isn't the only way to talk about the results. This is just one way, and it summarizes everything that came out of the unconscious selection experiment in one nice, tidy sentence. I was talking with Alexis and Jackson in my office last week about how I would write the results section. For this particular experiment, I would write it in 2 sentences. One sentence would cover unconscious selection, a second sentence would cover conscious selection. And then I would move on to more interesting things. So I can also envision it doing it in 4 sentences. If you wanted to divide up the information a little more, have shorter sentences. I am the king of long sentences, cramming as much as I can into a particular sentence. But you don't have to write that way. But it needs to be accurate. You need to have the equation correct. You need to have the F statistic. I should have put the 1 and 198 in subscript. I forgot to do that. But this is generally in subscripted form. But this gives you the basic outline of how you can talk about statistical results in an effective way that's clean and clear without getting too bogged down in the weeds. And if you need help with this, if you need help understanding what that equation means and stuff like that, as always, we can talk about it tomorrow in lab, or you can come by and see me in my office, and I can help you with that. So that thing is complete. It is on the Moodle site. Go read it, use it, and that will hopefully help you with that aspect of things. questions about anything from the last couple of time periods we've met? All right. I asked you to read a paper co-written by Bateson, and I forget who the other author is on it. Bateson and Leyland. And also chapter 1, the information in both of those things is complementary with one another. It's talking about how we ask questions in animal behavior. And so that's kind of the topic for today. Animal behavior, oftentimes we think of as its separate little silo within biology. Because I was trained as an ecologist, simultaneous with the way I was trained as a behaviorist. My doctoral dissertation is primarily dealing with the behavior of spiders, not an area of science that I encourage anyone to go into. Spiders are nice because you can usually get a lot of them, which means you can do lots of things with them because you have huge sample sizes, but they have their own sets of challenges. So behavior oftentimes is treated separately from other fields of study, but you have to recognize that there are other parts of science that influence behavior. So ecology is certainly important in understanding behavior because animals behave in a particular way based on the environment that they find themselves in. Behavior can be influenced by evolution. So these behaviors are oftentimes viewed as being evolved responses to environment. And when I talk about environment, I can mean the abiotic environment, but so much of behavior involves dealing with the biotic environment, dealing with other organisms, either other organisms who are members of your same species or dealing with other organisms that are members of other species. And then of course, genetics. A lot of the behaviors that we have are encoded by genetics. A lot of the sensory abilities that organisms have to receive sensory information from their environment, all of that is coded by genetics. So in order to understand behavior as this kind of silo, you need to have some knowledge of genetics, you need to have some knowledge of ecology, you need to have some knowledge of evolution, and your textbook is a textbook that is about behavioral ecology. If you've looked at your textbook, you'll see that it is an introduction to behavioral ecology, and behavioral ecology is kind of a subset of behavior that lies at the intersection of all of these different subdisciplines within biology. So, you guys have taken a course in evolution and ecology. Some of you may have taken an upper level course in ecology. I don't know, how many of you taken upper level ecology with? Okay, a couple of you have. You've all had a course in genetics, you've all had a course that dealt with evolution, whether they covered that. How much did you guys cover evolution and ecology? At all?
No, we didn't talk about animals in ecology.
Oh, really? A whole ecology class without talking about
Right.
animals?
We only talked about plants and berries.
Well, that makes sense. Dr. Judd is a plant biologist.
Right.
We studied evolution at the very least. Well, that's valid. I mean, you talk about what you know. I know animals. I'm talking about animals. Evolution, we covered in evolution ecology. Ecology, we covered in evolution ecology. Genetics, you have a whole course, either with me or with Dr. Reynolds. And we're going to be talking about behavior. So we're going to be reviewing genetic concepts when we talk about evolution. We're going to be reviewing a number of ecological concepts as we go through this, talking about competition, how organisms deal with the abiotic environment, temperature, moisture, et cetera, So all of this kind of intersects here in the middle with behavioral ecology, which is what your textbook is about and what this class is about. So if you're following along in your slides have a couple of links to videos, but because I can't seem to get my computer to interact well with the screen in here, I just queued them up so that they're ready to go. So let's put our observation caps on for a few minutes. Forgive the music. This is the thing about YouTube videos, sometimes you're subjected to other people's editorial choices. This is unfortunately in a terrarium. Guy's sitting on top of a box turtle. That's a box turtle skull. You can see her shadow on the back wall of this terrarium. This is the male. And the act is finished. And we can get rid of the piano music.
Did he win the mate?
Well, it's in a terrarium. There's only one female, and if she's gonna get lucky, there's just that male to get lucky with. So as you look at these lizards, what are some questions that come into your mind based on the reading that you did in chapter 1 and the reading that you did from the Bateson and Leyland paper? Yeah, Alexis.
Maybe like, how did the dewlap evolve?
Okay, so you can ask yourself, and it isn't just the dewlap, it's also the behavior associated with the dewlap. So the dewlap itself is a morphological characteristic, but then the behaviors associated with the dewlap also are capable of having evolved. So you might actually phrase it in terms of behavior and morphology. What else might you ask about this?
Maybe like, was it always for that purpose? Like, what is it for?
Especially the second video would point you towards what as a function?
Attracting a mate?
Attracting a mate. Is that the only possible function?
Probably not.
Probably not. So you would have alternative hypotheses as to what the function might be, in the same way that there may be multiple functions for impaling prey on thorns in butcher birds. There may be multiple functions for dewlap displays in anoles. What other kinds of questions might you ask?
How does it work?
Explain that one to me. Somebody other than Kennedy.
By what mechanism does it extend its neck?
Okay, so this would be an area that we call in biology functional morphology. What is the dewlap made up of? How is it attached to muscles? How do those muscles contract to extend that dewlap? What's the range of motion that you can get out of that dewlap? Those are these proximate causes of kind of how the whole thing functions, rather than how it evolved versus what is it for. What's the fourth question of Tinbergen's 4 questions?
How did it develop during the lifetime of the individual?
Do males and females have dewlaps? Do individuals have dewlaps that are fully functional when they're first born, or do they change over time and only become fully formed in the adult? What's the allometry of the dewlap? Does it get bigger and bigger over time as the individual grows? Does it peak out at some size? Many amphibians or reptiles experience what's called indeterminate growth, which means that as long as they are alive, they continue growing. Does that dewlap continue growing such that older individuals are not only bigger in body size, but also have a bigger dewlap? These are Tinbergen's 4 questions. And he put these forth at a time in animal behavior when people weren't thinking very clearly about animal behavior, and he wanted to clarify people's thinking so that when they looked at behavior, they could ask these questions of any behavior, but then when they did research on behavior, they could focus their research on, I'm going to do research that focuses on the functional morphology of the dewlap. How does the dewlap work? I can ignore for now how it might have evolved. I can ignore for now whether or not it has an adaptive significance. I can ignore all of these other questions. I can concentrate on one question and as a result, perhaps make more progress on the questions that I have rather than getting muddled up and divided in my attentions from one question to another. As you read the first chapter and or Bateson and Lalande, how did these questions strike you? They were proposed in 1963.
Rather basic or
They're-
vague.
Is it basic or vague? In what way?
Just like I feel like you could go down a rabbit hole with some of them, like
Okay.
how did it develop or how does it work? There could be so many different avenues that you can like travel down for a certain.
Okay, so there might be multiple avenues. Could there be multiple avenues for any of these questions? How about other questions that you've been confronted with in science? You can answer with my background. Sure.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's just an endless tunnel of possible questions that you can ask. So while it may be a criticism of this set of questions, I don't know that it's any different than a criticism of any other set of questions. So this is a relatively recent paper, 2017, I think. This shows ethograms of head bobbing and dewlap extension in anoles in Puerto Rico. You can see when the head is dipped, when the dewlap is retracted for 4 different species, 2 in Jamaica, 2 in Puerto Rico. This is one way of describing this behavior in kind of pseudo-quantitative ways. And then when we think about these 4 questions, the question of how does it work is in the realm of functional ecology or functional morphology. What is the structure of the thing made out of? How is it attached to these muscles? How does the behavioral pattern of the individual vary as it uses these things? And specifically, what is the morphology, functional morphology of the extension of this dewlap? As we go through and look at the rest of these, they are simple, but the nice thing about the simplicity of them is that they focus what we're doing. And that's actually, I think, one of the utilities of Tinbergen's 4 questions. In the Bateson and Lalande paper, what did they say about the relationship between these 4 questions?
Said like to answer one, you might have to answer another, or in answering one, you might also find an answer to another.
Actually, don't recall that in Bateson and Lalande's paper at all. At least not in the way Tinbergen first envisioned these questions.
Maybe that was more of a critique.
Maybe more of a critique, but when Tinbergen first proposed these, what did he say about them? For those of you looking at the paper, it's right after they finish describing the different questions in the Bateson and Lalande paper.
Directly right after the questions, it says, although Tinbergen was concerned with behavior, the 4 questions apply broadly to any characteristic in living and even some non-living systems.
Sure. And then they describe a non-living system.
Yeah, triangle, sure.
Mm-hmm. Alexis, it would be nice if knowing the answer to one of these questions would inform us about the answer to the others, but what is going to more often happen when you have such simple and discrete sorts of questions?
When you come to like an answer begets another question from the same category, maybe?
Yeah, oftentimes, to what Tinbergen envisioned, to clarify people's thinking about animal behavior, Tinbergen envisioned a set of questions that would be to a large degree mutually exclusive. Answering a question about how does something work doesn't necessarily tell you anything about how that developed over time. Knowing how something developed might or might not tell you something about how it evolved, but chances are, in many cases, knowing how something is developing over the ontogeny of an organism probably won't tell you much about what the evolutionary forces were that drove a species to possess that particular behavior. So it's the opposite of what you said earlier, which is that Tinbergen envisioned these things as mutually exclusive answers to, or mutually exclusive questions about behavior, each one of which informs you about that behavior, but it gives you a different lens to look at that behavior through. And that lens doesn't necessarily overlap with the view that you get from looking through these other lenses. Now, one of the disadvantages of that is exactly the advantage that Alexis called to, which is it would be nice to have a more integrated view of behavior, wouldn't it? It would be nice to know not only how a particular behavior works, but also what are the evolutionary forces that led to that behavior becoming what it is. But Tinbergen ultimately envisioned these things as four separate and distinct, non-overlapping questions. Answers to one question doesn't necessarily have to provide any insight into one of the other questions. He viewed that as a positive aspect. I think over time we've probably come to view that as maybe not the best way of thinking about behavior, especially in modern term. What do you guys know about development? How many of you have taken Dr. Vora's developmental biology class? Okay, a number of you. Why do you think development is important in behavior? Bryce, you were about to say something? Go ahead.
I mean, I was thinking about something. I mean, if it's something with a complex enough brain to have its environment affect its behavior later on, then I mean, whatever environment it's in will determine its behavior.
Yeah, so development can be super important, especially if one of the main ways in which behavior is mediated is through neural activity. And so anything that happens during the development of the brain, that's going to have to influence behavior. Are you guys at all familiar with, and I don't expect you to be familiar with, the development of song, the ability to sing in birds? No? Yeah, not surprising. We'll talk about it later on. As it turns out, during early development of nestlings, there's this window during which you get exposed to birdsong. And if you're exposed to birdsong during that window, you have a much better ability to develop birdsong when you are an adult. So in some species, like the mockingbird, what do you know about birdsong and the mockingbird, just from your environment? Yeah.
That's a state.
State bird of Texas, yeah, sure.
They can mimic, I've actually done it before, like you can go like, and it'll like echo it,
Yeah, so one of the things about the mockingbird, the reason it's called the mockingbird, is it has a really wide repertoire of calls. It has its own species-specific calls, but it also mimics the calls of a lot of other birds in their environment. I'm not sure why they have that ability. I'm not sure what the it turns out I do know what the adaptive function of that is. We can talk about that another day. But they have this ability. As it turns out, if you take mockingbirds and you isolate them during this narrow period of early development of nestlings, they lose the ability to have as wide a repertoire of song as an individual if that individual is out in nature listening to song. If you take individuals from species where they don't have a wide repertoire of songs, but they just have one stereotypical species-specific song, and you deny them hearing their species-specific song during this narrow window during nestling development, they lack the ability when they are adults to produce their own species song. So there's this thing that ornithologists refer to as an auditory template, something that happens in the brain where when they're very early on listening, something about the development of their brain, those song cues get fixed in their brain, and if they don't get that auditory input at that particular stage of development, they lack the ability to produce either the repertoire of songs that they would normally produce, or in some cases their own species-specific song. They grow up not having song because they were never exposed to song during that crucial point of development. And in some cases, it's just a period of 3 or 4 days where there's this opening for development of that ability. And if you don't get the right oral inputs during that time period, you're just basically screwed for the rest of your life as a song, because one of the main ways in which birds attract other birds is by singing. And so development is hugely more important today, and Bateson and Leyland talk about this in their paper, is hugely more important in thinking about behavior than it was back in Tinbergen's time. In Tinbergen's time, we just listened to birds singing. We assumed that all birds sang the same. They all had their stereotypical species-specific calls, and those were encoded in genes, and that was the end of it. Bunch of research in the 70s and 80s that you probably wouldn't be able to do anymore because of institutional animal care and use committee rules allowed people to deny birds of these oral inputs, and they found that when they lacked those things, they were unable to reproduce those species-specific songs. Guess what?
What?
Similar thing happens in humans. If you isolate humans during early development, keep them away from a lot of oral input, guess what that affects in humans?
Language development.
It affects their language development for all of the same reasons, yeah.
There was that girl that was like kept in one room for like 13 years of her life. Do you remember? Have you heard about that?
I don't know the specific case that you're thinking about, but I
can't
can
remember her
imagine.
name, but like, yeah, she had significant difficulties developing.
Yeah, when you talk to early childhood psychologists, one of the things they tell you is to talk and read to your babies when they're very young, because that basically sets up this auditory template that allows them to acquire language more effectively when they're older. Doesn't matter that they don't necessarily know what you're talking about. Doesn't matter that they can't respond with language themselves. It's the act of hearing it that affects their neural development, that then affects their ability to master language in the future. So in this way, humans are not that different from birds, and development is hugely important in most of these cases. In the case of these 4 questions, how did this behavior and morphology evolve? What is it used for? How does it work? How does it develop? When we think about these things in the context of the paper that we just talked about, Joseph and Pinchot, which of these questions does Joseph and Pinchot's paper primarily address?
What is it for?
It's 2 things, Jackson.
I said, what is it for?
What is it for? And you said?
I said the fitness value of the behavior.
So actually, it kind of addresses 2 things, doesn't it? It addresses what's it for, like what is its purpose, but embedded in that is also that purpose is driven by an adaptive function. So there's a reproductive outcome, which is certainly would affect the evolution of it, but primarily when you say what is it for, that's usually an issue of adaptive function. And so in this case, it really is talking about the adaptive function. What is the purpose of it in terms of increasing the fitness values of the individuals who possess this behavior? Question about Tinbergen's 4 questions.
What do you mean by phylogenetic constraint?
Oh, phylogenetic constraint. Okay. Phylogeny is interesting because every organism on the planet has an evolutionary history that organism came out of. You guys are all members of the genus Homo. We are all members of the order, of the family Hominidae. We are all members of the order Primates. We are all primates. We are evolutionarily related to the great apes. They're our most recent ancestors, et cetera, et cetera. So we have this shared evolutionary history. Now, the thing about phylogenetics is that as you are evolving on this tree of life, I don't know the full details of the tree of life with the primates. I can't remember if gorillas are out here. or if orangutans are out here. I think it's gorillas and then orangutans as you get further and further away from humans. But I have to go and check that. But I do know about this particular branch of it. At some point on this phylogenetic tree, so time, remember always that time is going from left to right on phylogenies, and usually morphological or genetic distinctiveness is on the y-axis. So the further away you are in the vertical plane, in the vertical axis, the further away you are genetically, and time is going from the past on the left-hand side to the present on the right-hand side. So we share certain things in common with the two species of chimpanzees, the regular chimpanzee, Pan troglodytes, and the bonobo chimps. And we share a lot of things with them. We have opposable thumbs, we have 5 digits on our hands, we have 5 digits on our feet. We share that actually with a lot of vertebrates, not all vertebrates, but a lot of vertebrates, our digit number. We share the fact that we have body hair, et cetera, et cetera. So phylogenetic constraint is when you possess a set of characteristics, or a single characteristic even, because you inherited it from some common ancestor. And it may not have any adaptive value now. It may have adaptive value in the future, who knows, but it's there in you not because of its current adaptive value, it's there because you essentially inherited it from your ancestors, and it's gonna probably take a lot of selection to get rid of it, whatever it happens to be. And in some cases, these things that we're saddled with evolutionarily can actually constrain future evolution. So, for example, you guys all walk upright, correct? Have you ever tried to walk on all fours? The way another quadruped would walk? So remember, quadrupeds don't walk the way we crawl. If I told you to get down on all fours, what would you do?
Get on your knees.
You'd get on your knees, wouldn't you? You would go down on your knees, and your knee would be touching the ground, and your hands would be touching the ground. In all the other organisms that are quadrupeds, what touches the ground? The feet. So now, if I asked you to quadruped to locomote like a regular quadruped would locomote, what do you have to do? You have to come up off of your feet, off of your knees, onto your feet, and suddenly you're just totally out of whack. You're off balance, your arms are way too short, your legs are way too long, either one of those. Whatever there is, your arms and legs are mismatched, and you are not nearly as capable of quadrupedal locomotion as you are of bipedal locomotion, because you evolved bipedal locomotion. And so not suddenly, over the course of millions of years, you have evolved a morphology that prevents you from locomoting on 4 limbs very effectively. You ever seen a chimp run? Chimps run, do they run bipedal or quadrupedal? They're quadrupedal. What's different about a chimp's morphology than our morphology? Their arms are very long, their back legs are relatively short, and when they locomote quadrupedally, they're using their arms almost like crutches. The long arms go out in front, and then they swing the front legs up. They land on the front legs, then they bring the arms out in front, and they're just kind of loping along, arm to feet, arm to feet, arm to feet. They're not doing what a horse does. If you ever watch a horse run, when a horse runs, the legs operate opposite of one another. As the foreleg in the front is going forward, the back leg in the right, left foreleg is going front, right hind leg goes forward, and then as right foreleg goes forward, left foreleg comes forward. So they're opposite. Chimps don't run that way. Chimps run hand to feet, hand to feet, hand to feet, hand to feet. Yeah.
Well, horses, they trot and then prance in that motion, but they also can lope.
They can also lope. Yes, I'm simplifying horse gaits for the purposes of time and simplicity. Yeah, you can study the gaits of all kinds of quadrupedal organisms. Camels do things in a totally different way. Camels go left side, right side, left side, right side, left side, right side. If you've ever ridden a camel, anybody ever ridden a camel? How smooth is a camel? How smooth is a camel to ride?
Not very.
It's not very, because it has what we refer to as a gated stride. Well, what enables a chimpanzee to locomote with all four limbs that way is the fact that it has really long forearms relative to its hind limbs that enables it to move really quickly using all four of its limbs. We've evolved out of that. We suck at quadrupedal locomotion because we evolved into bipedalism, and by evolving into bipedalism, we have shut off the avenue of future evolution into quadrupedal locomotion. This is what a phylogenetic constraint is. By evolving into doing one thing, that shuts off those other avenues that you've evolved away from as being part of your evolutionary future.
But
It's
where does-
constrained you to be a particular thing.
Where does the inheritance come into the bipedal example? Like, did we inherit that, or that evolved?
We evolved it over time, but inherent in evolution is inheritance. You can only inherit those things you can only evolve those things that have a genetic basis, and so that inheritance is implied in the evolution of bipedalism. So sometime between when we left the chimpanzees and bonobos and went off on our own evolutionarily, we evolved from being quadrupeds to being bipeds, and once we turned that corner, it's going to be very difficult to turn back. We're now constrained to bipedalism. Any of you ever experienced backaches? Okay. One of the reasons that we have backaches is that we have a spine that is patently slow to catch up with our bipedal habits. If you look at all of the other quadrupedal organisms, they have spines that are essentially arched. Even if you look at chimpanzees and bonobos, their backbone tends to go head, arched back, legs, arms. Their back is arched this way. What does ours do? Ours is serpentine. Ours is serpentine because we've had to alter our geometry in order to stand bipedal. And the unfortunate thing about that is that it doesn't work as well as it should in many ways. And so constraint can also mean that in the process of evolving something, your evolution works on the variation that is available. And as a result, it doesn't always come up with perfect solutions to problems over evolutionary time. These solutions are oftentimes compromises. And in the case of the structure of the human backbone, it's a compromise that quite frankly, if it were designed by an intelligent designer, it should work better than it currently does. So does that help, Alexis, with that? Okay. All right, now we get to have fun. Going to go back to videos, and I want you to pay careful attention to this next set of videos. It is the Lion King.
Life's not fair. You see, I shall never be king. And you shall never see the light of another day.
Oh, sad.
And you,
Did your mother ever tell you not to play with your food?
what do you want?
I'm here to announce that King Mufasa's on his way. So you'd better have a good excuse for missing the ceremony this morning.
That looks as if you make me lose my lunch.
Ha! You'll lose more than that when the king gets through with you. He's as mad as a hippo with a hernia.
I quiver with fear.
Now, Scar, don't look at me that way.
Scar.
James Earl Jones.
Impeccable timing, Your Majesty.
Why? It isn't like big brother descending from on high to mingle with the commoners.
Sarabi and I didn't see you at the presentation of Simba.
So based on what you've read in chapter 1, what's correct and not correct biologically about lion behavior in this scene from a Disney cartoon? Did you guys read chapter 1?
To be fair,
I
this
didn't know
list
it-
says to
I
read
didn't know
chapter
it
one
says
for
to read chapter one.
Wednesday.
Oh, for really? For Wednesday?
Really?
Yeah, that's what is on the schedule.
Oh, my apologies then.
We're doing our best.
Sorry. Sorry.
Well,
I
it's
know, I was,
like,
I thought I was the only one.
oh.
Sorry, chapter 1 is also dealing with the 4 questions, so my bad. You wouldn't normally see 2 brothers in charge of a pride. Generally, you would have a single male in charge of a pride. What a single male does generally is it roots all of this subordinate males out of a pride so that it doesn't get challenged in its leadership. Let's go to the next video. Simba, cute little Simba. Always going off and getting in trouble. Famous wildebeest stampede scene. Oh my god, it just goes on forever.
Mufasa, quick, stampede in the gorge. Simba's down there. Simba.
Scar is so concerned. It's terribly dramatic, I know.
The king.
Here we have the death of Mufasa. So, Scar has basically orchestrated the death of Mufasa, and of course, why is he killing off Mufasa? So he can take over the pride. You guys have seen this movie. How many times? So many times.
What have you done?
such sympathy from
Never
Scar.
means for these things to happen.
What?
But the king is dead. If it weren't for you, he'd still be alive. What will your mother think?
What am I gonna do?
Runaways. Run. Run away and never return.
Run away and never return. So, Caleb, what were you just saying to me?
Well, in the book, the lions practice it inside, so they kill all the cubs when they take over the pride.
So, in your textbook, when a male lion takes over a pride, he doesn't orchestrate the death of the leader of the pride and then tell the young little cubs to run away and hide. He actually kills all of the young in the pride. It's called infanticide. It's well known to be practiced in lion pride.
Just because they're not his offspring.
Okay.
Scarlet
Is that
was
why?
killed so brutally after.
So,
Did they kill the females too?
no, all the cubs, period, all the cubs. So, the Lion King, I hate to break it to you, is loosely predicated on the practice in actual lions of infanticide. You come into a lion pride, you clear out all of the offspring that existed there before you took over that pride. And of course, they couldn't do that in a Disney film, why not?
Geared towards kids.
Well, because it's geared towards kids and they would not, parents would not take their kids to a Disney movie that then traumatized them for life. And also,
There's no story.
it would have been the end of the story at that point. But recognize that biologically, this movie is based on something that actually happens out in the wild. When a male comes in, takes over a pride, deposes the current male is booted out, typically, and becomes a solitary male. And the first thing that the new male does is kill all the babies. And so Jackson, was it Jackson or Logan? Jackson said, why do they do this? What was your answer?
Oh, no, that
No,
wasn't.
no.
That wasn't.
Oh, that was, okay, I thought it was.
Because none of the offspring, none of the cubs are his.
So he's genetically unrelated to all of those offspring, so why would he spend any time defending the pride from other males, et cetera, to defend a bunch of offspring that aren't even genetically related to him? What are other possible explanations? Yeah.
So he can mate and have a multitude of cubs with like female lions in the pride.
One of the things in lion prides is that happens is mating synchrony. Typically, all the females come into estrus at the same time. There are good biological reasons for this. If everybody is in estrus at the same time, they'll give birth at the same time. When the babies are born, if some females are out hunting, other females can nurse young back at pride. They also exhibit communal suckling, as the book refers to it. So a single female will nurse any of the babies in the pride at the time. One of the ways in which synchrony of estrus gets synchronized is when you kill all of the babies. There's no longer suckling. Suckling is one of the things that, as a feedback neurologically, actually promotes lactation. The females are no longer lactating, and they can then stop investing energy in that, and they can go into estrus and have another reproductive bout. And so there are two possible explanations as to why infanticide might occur in males, in lions, when a male takes over a new pride. And these are two of them mentioned by your book. And like I said, in The Lion King, they had to bring this up because we don't want to scar young children. But essentially, it's this idea that we take from nature. Your book will then go on to talk about how we go about testing these two hypotheses in lion prides. And since I am a little bit ahead, and because I didn't ask you to read chapter 1 until Wednesday, we only have a couple minutes left in class. We'll just put off that discussion. So as you're reading chapter 1, concentrate on the section dealing with adaptive explanations for this behavior of infanticide in male lions when they take over prides. And it'll be essentially an extension of these ideas of Tinbergen's. What are the kinds of questions that you can ask of this behavior infanticide? How did it evolve? Does it change during ontogeny? Does ontogeny affect the ultimate expression of this particular trait? What's the adaptive advantage of this trait? And how could this particular trait have evolved to the point that it would be loosely the basis of a Disney cartoon? And now you have to go back and rewatch The Lion King with a new set of behavioral eyes. Bad idea for Scar to spare the life of Simba, right? Because what happens? Simba comes back. It would have been so much. It would have been so much better for Scar if he had just
Spoiler alert, sorry.
killed Simba like a regular lion.
He didn't get all the smart genes.
Maybe he didn't get all the smart genes. All right, questions. This is the last Disney movie we will watch in this class. Yeah, Alexis.
When we're reading, will all of the pertinent stuff from the reading be discussed in class, or should we be like how extent, should we treat the reading as an introduction or as like something we need to study on our own?
I will rely heavily on a lot of the examples in the book. I chose this book because I like this book. I chose this book because it takes a quantitative approach to thinking about behavior. So it forces you to think about behavior as something that can be modeled and tested quantitatively. A long controversy in animal behavior is the issue of a theoretical model might predict certain values, certain quantitative values about that behavior. For example, in the case of foraging, there are a set of models that predict how long you should stay in a patch and how much energy you should gain from that patch in an animal that is foraging in an area where resources are distributed patchily. There's a patch of food here, and then there's an area without any food, and then there's a patch of food over here. One of the things that has been learned over decades is that these quantitative models that people build to describe behavior, when you then go and test behavior in the field or in the lab, oftentimes there's general qualitative match to the model, but there's seldom quantitative match to the model. And there's a whole body of theory and papers that kind of discuss why the models that we create to describe behavior don't necessarily match up with what organisms actually do in a very precise way. They match in a general way, but they don't match in a precise way. And so I like that this book introduces you to quantitative ways of thinking about animal behavior, because ultimately it would be nice to know, if you have a catch size of a certain size, what does that mean in terms of your total offspring? How does the energy that you expend in maintaining that cache and gathering up all those prey items and displaying, does that translate into what we would expect the reproductive output to be? Does it correspond to precisely to what we would expect, or does it correspond just in general terms as to what we would expect? So I like the book because of its quantitative approach to things. We're going to see that a little bit in class on Wednesday. And then I just kind of like the way it talks about things. It takes a patently evolutionary approach to everything. Like it just undergirds the whole thing. And other animal behavior books do that also, but this does that particularly well. So actually, I'm going to rely probably more heavily on the textbook in this class than in any other class that you've ever taken with me.
Right, but my question is, do I need to teach myself the important things from the chapter, or are you going to teach us what's critical in the chapter?
You need to prepare yourself to come in and talk about the important things in the chapter. You will see, well, let me see if I can answer this question. So here are the slides that are coming up.
Yeah, there's a bunch of figures that I'm sure are in the chapter.
There are a bunch of figures that are from the chapter.
Yes.
Da 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 da. These are not from the chapter, these are from literature. Blah 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 blah. And towards the end, So, am I going to give you a text, am I gonna give you a chapter in the textbook, expect you to absorb that chapter all by yourself and never talk about it in class? No. But I want you to read the chapter before you come to class so that we're prepared to talk about it in class, because I will be relying on the information in the textbook quite a lot. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay, right. Should've just said that at the beginning.
It's okay.
Alright, other questions? I'll see you tomorrow at 8 o'clock in 219. You will have all read Lehman and Dill, and you will have all gone through Lehman and Dill looking for all those writing mistakes, and we'll talk about writing tomorrow in the lab. Alright?
Are we looking at, like, are we going outside tomorrow or?
No, it's all literature tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah.
Three?
I think we do, yeah. Yeah, I think
Today's
so.
the first one.
It's usually the first Monday of the semester.
Can we figure out our?
Yeah, right now, you're free right now.
Well, did you get a chance to look at that?
I started looking at it. Your first sentence isn't failure inducing, but your first